So I'm going to update this twice today because I'm not going to be doing it tomorrow. A friend of mine called me, and a friend of mine whose politics and mine seemingly diverged a long time ago, and whose politics and mine may be getting closer through a long dialogue, which is sometimes oppositional, sometimes yelly. They definitely call me on my shit. So I wanted to state a correction. I said that the idea of meritocracy comes from the 1920s. Um, the source that I linked actually points out that it was in 19 it really was mocking developments of the 1950s. The concept of the meritocratic society, and this, arguably goes back to Jefferson's natural aristocracy arguments. So it has a long history in liberal thinking, but its exact name is new. But my friend pushed back on me a little bit on something that we talk about, a lot, and we don't talk about in left circles enough. And it's complex society and highly dense technological societies and expertise. Because how can you be against meritocratic society when you need expertise to stop outbreaks of cholera, outbreaks of COVID-19? And so you have this tension between expertise and democratic imperatives. Furthermore, the expertise regimes and the experts actually tend to have unintentionally a generational cycle that follows what Weber was talking about when I talked about meritocracy. They, without realizing it, accumulate expertise, knowledge, pass those advantages down to their children. But those children, since they don't come up in the same way, tend to start degenerating over about a 3-generation cycle. Right? Um, Now, I know I sound like I'm not, this does not come my normal Marxist analysis because it doesn't. Generational studies isn't something that Marx really goes into. If you want to understand generational studies, you read something like Peter Turchin and Cleodynamics, and they are at odds. I don't always agree with Turchin on these things, but he talks about the need of expertise and complication, pushing elites who can hoard the knowledge, but these expertise, claims also start hoarding opportunity, and this goes on. And there's the irrational form of it, and there's the rationalized form of it. Well, this is where the rationalized form of it actually matters, because you need surgeons, and you need a way to find surgeons, as my friend Keith, I'll name him here, points out to me. And I know this, obviously. I work in education. What you have, though, now is a conflation of those skills with basically moral skills. And this is where Catherine Liu, I think, may be onto something. Whether or not I agree with her class frameworks and the way, and picking up the stuff from John and Barbara Ehrenreich, particularly Barbara's reformations of it, there is a long history going back to Pareto of understanding how elites emerge from complexity. And it's a form of specialization. It's basically a similar tendency to what causes class society in the first place. But they also, because they set up a lot of the rules, even unknowingly, start to reduce expertise, either through hyper specialization, in which case they can't see things from outside of their field and thus get blindsided by events because they're too specialized, or by basically unwillingly, unknowingly, or knowingly, actually, I don't want to say that it's all in good faith, setting up institutions that favor their descendants, either ideological or literal, and their class. Now, I don't like the term false consciousness for a lot of reasons because it's abused. But there really is a sense where people have a false consciousness about their own democratic imperatives. Liberals will talk about the need for a democracy and yet, be mad that there's anyone who would oppose their expertise. And conversely, people opposing their expertise are doing so on grounds that seem illegitimate at first, but when you look at all the mistakes and incompetencies that are hidden amongst the quote elites unquote, which are real, um, you understand where their paranoia comes from and why they want a democratic check, even though a lot of what they're positing is frankly, popular prejudice and the mood of the crowds. Now, this can have left or right formations. I mean, this is not limited to the right wing, and despite what anyone may tell you. We've seen this go in many different ways, and frankly, um, historically speaking, it is the middle classes that emerge to push back on these forms of sporadic expertise in prior societies and in early capitalism. And it's also those same classes that, and people who are minorities within them, who get scapegoated when this happens. Um, Historically, that is Chinese immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Parsis, people like that, and depending on the society. And I'm not just talking about America here. So you have a minority group that is fairly insular but highly skilled, for a variety of historical reasons, and they get scapegoated. Um, so you have two tendencies here. You have a tendency of the PMC to mean, some groups that people have racial grievances with, and also, but you also have this tendency of central management and of highly skilled labor to protect itself. And politically, that manifests in this way of, cultural capital virtue mongering. Lou calls this virtue hoarding. So, like I said, I don't love Lou's class framework, but I think she is onto something in a way some other people aren't. Here's the thing, though. To address this, you need both I think, a Marxist and a Weberian notion of class together. The Marxist notion of class is production explains how all this is functioning to keep everything going. There are real rulers and they're real owners of society. It's not just the center tier, but they need managers. They need specialization. The old heroic bourgeois, in so much that it ever existed, hasn't existed since like 1910. The progressive era, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, however you feel about them, and Woodrow Wilson, and people who we love to hate on now because of their inherently racist assumptions. Um, well, they were the beginnings of the end of a Brahmin class that existed actually before an entrepreneurial class, but also people who tried to rationalize an increasingly chaotic and unstable entrepreneurial class. Whether or not you believe that there is a knowledge problem, and believe it or not, I actually do think there is a knowledge problem. I actually think there are issues with human capacity in any given situation. I know that's unpopular for someone who advocates for a non-market society, but what I see in market societies is the same thing. The tendency towards monopolization, which happens naturally through the accumulation of markets, can only be fought against by a countervailing force, which tends to protect uh, inefficient and frankly backwards markets in many cases, as to stop the predatorization of monopoly. But the monopolization happens anyway, and you can only do so much about it because the smaller forms are inefficient. And effectively, they become like governments. But when the large forms become inefficient, you get something like socialism for the rich under capitalism. And while libertarians might complain about crony capitalism, they know, or they should know, that the devastation caused by unregulated entrepreneurial capitalism led to capitalism being very, very unpopular. Someone like Joseph Schumpeter points this out. Now, so far, I'm not talking very much Marxist stuff, and actually, something that's guiding me here is Joseph Tainter's The Colossal Complex Society. As I was mentioning, if you have a very dense city, you need someone to protect against cholera. Density requires expertise. It does. Um, You have increasingly complex systems that require increasing amount of mental capacity, going to increasingly specialized work, but it also means you get blindsided more and the expertise is more limited. Furthermore, you have technocrats who resent, and somewhat rightly actually, you can think of this almost as a dialectical antagonism process, who resent democratic inputs from people who don't know what they're talking about, and you have people who resent the technocratic trying to order their lives beyond the expertise to bracket out social problems that are hard for them to fix. If you've ever talked to an engineer, you've seen this. Let's be real for a second. You and I both know that the Weberian description of meritocracy, and Weber doesn't call it that. Weber calls it the instrumentalized rationalization of modernity, creates a seemingly rational system that does require experts and does sometimes produce them, but also produces a lot of divisions that are arbitrary. But also, there is such a thing as human difference and human difference in capacity. Marx talks about this explicitly in the Critique of the Goethe program. I don't talk about equality in abstract, like hardly ever, because it's not that relevant. I always talk about removing the impediments to our lives. You could think of it as making actual meritocracy possible, but I don't know that you actually can, because once you have the development of classes, you have to have something to push back on the merit, the quote unquote meritocratic people. Otherwise, you have a limit. And so you have cycles of different kinds of elites going up against each other. Most people involved are acting in unconscious bad faith. But they're also, most people really believe what they say. They believe in the moral position of those who they're attacking or defending, and they believe in their friend-enemy distinctions. Whether or not they work is another question. My friend Keith chastised me for doing the thing where we all recite our class origins like we recite our race origins or whatever. But I also am saying there are limitations to what I'm saying. Like, I didn't have the same relationship to meritocracy as a lot of people who come from people who had a lot of highly advanced skills. And here's another thing. Those highly advanced skills are not limited to white collar work. You see this actually in trades. This is becoming kind of a crisis because you have so many people now. I think the average person in electrical, the average electrician is somewhere in their 50s. You have many trades where, since we quit doing vocational education in high school in America, to force, well, not to force, but to encourage people to enter more technocratic degrees, because we thought we could outsource a lot of this, although I have no idea how you could outsource electricians forever. You saw the development of a deracinated, there really isn't enough people in these fields. Furthermore, these fields are not very recession resistant. So people enter, they crash, and they leave. We saw that with construction. Those people don't come back, but then we also don't train new ones to replace them. We're beginning to see this even in white collar professions. This is happening in teaching. All right. So while I might bristle at the idea of the professional managerial class, because I don't think they're exactly a class, there's a real strata of people who may be developing a class interest here. The way it's presented in the popular press, outside of actually some people who are not trying to pretend to be on the left, is usually misleading. But it's real. There is a sense where credentialization and the increase of bureaucracy and the increase of things like what David Graeber called bullshit jobs actually aren't, they're not irrational. They're rational within specializations. They're rational because of legal requirements. They're only irrational when you look at the entire system. We would talk about this as kluges. I guess maybe instead of my normal leftist optimism, I'm saying you're in a cycle. And you're in a cycle where, frankly, I think a lot of this progressive notion of history is falling down for people. So they're going, instead of the prior technological progress or political progress or legal progress, which is all these ideas are becoming bankrupt. We're now relying on moral progress, which is almost a religious notion. So you have a tension here that is very, very real. The need for experts is real, and the impossibility of meritocracy is real. The need for, the fact that even primitivists can't and won't, they actually just keep on saying that a natural collapse will force it for them. Uh, you have a highly resource inefficient society in capitalism. You do, and it's just sucking up tons of the world's resources. And as the world gets wealthier, if you don't want the entire world to be doomed to poverty and massive chaos, you have to deal with that. But you also have a system that is overly complex. It is overly complex. You also have a system where, despite the quote capitalist promise of a non-control system, we clearly see that it's controlled. That markets are formed by collective actors. That the threat of social instability from big businesses causes them to be supported at the expense of other people. That we increasingly see easy answers posited. I mean, one of the things I think I push on MMT, and I'll mention the MMT humanities people, because they admit that the focus on sovereignty is a problem for MMT, and that a lot of the popular presentations of this basically bracket out a lot of things that are not easily answered. You know, what are the political imperatives for a job guarantee? Where are how do you deal with the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, which was really about, frankly, your ability of either production or weapons manufacture. I mean, and your ability to control that. So big nations will always have an advantage over small ones there. How do you deal with the fact that that we're having a natural worldwide population slowdown, which is traditionally considered a sign of a failing society, but that we also desperately need it, because while we could house more people, if we reorganize the way we, without using up tons of resources, it's not an absolute research burn. We also know that that's not likely to happen, and so we are adjusting to that reality. The feedbacks create costs that make children prohibitive. But also, this leads to being more invested in their future in a way that leads to helicopter parenting and glass flooring. There's also basic denial of the facts. From climate change, where even most popular left things have now avoided it, to the fact that declining GDPs have caused, the rise of the need for declining rate for profits real, my friends. They're not consistent. It's not a thing, but GDP goes down over time, and GDP is not even the greatest measure of, economic profits. But what we got, right? Watch GDP trends. They don't consistently drop. Like, they consistently drop on aggregate. They don't drop all the time. You see, but early GDP in America was like 10%. Oh, GDP 20 years ago in China was like 10%. Now it's like 6%. And that's better than what we can do, but still, it is a decline. These are realities. Complexity generates realities. And people accumulating generate realities. And they generate complexity. and then you get blindsided. My belief in socialism, not even because I believe in a planned economy, it's because I think market economies don't get you out of the problem. Even if you incorporate markets into that, your goal has to be declining exploitation. And, if there are elites, they emerge from merit. And how do you protect, stop that meritocratic system, which I don't really believe in. I don't really believe it's possible to have a purely meritocratic system. But that meritocratic system is checked against, so it doesn't generate new arbitrary elites, even if it started off legitimate. I think basically right now we've seen people go from liberal, stick their head in the sands, to like fantasy land about what radicalism really means. If radicalism is the root of the problem, then most of the talk we got is not radical. It is avoiding the roots of the problem. It is abstractifying abstractions. It is hiding the real abstractions and even more nebulous ones. If this makes you sound like makes you think I'm black pilled or don't believe in politics anymore, you're taking the wrong thing. This is why I talked about the line. The programmatic line has got to be more important. You have to be willing to deal with the fact that you have to generate a kind of, a mentality that would encourage the kind of people who could hold a line, that could produce some of the things that could have merit. I mean, one of the greatest things that I think is so hilarious is like classical liberal radicals. I mean, liberal radicals, not socialists. Someone like Henry George thought that inheritance should be abolished because it was anti-meritocratic. Because it was effectively arbitrary. It wasn't based on merit. It was based on who came up. But inheritance is also seems like the easiest, most fair way to most people to adjudicate a family's resources. But we see what it does. It is the primary driver of what people like to call structural inequality and structural racism, is inherited wealth over time. You could get rid of systemic, I say this over and over again, but I mean it. You can get rid of systemic bias and bigotry, and you would still have that problem. My friend Keith, and I'm being too personal here, mayhaps, but Chad to me, and I think maybe he's right, that I want to be able to give a treatment before the diagnosis is done, and if the diagnosis is larger than our manuals say. I mean, after all, if Marxism had the clear, unequivocated answer to it, when half the world was under a Marxist government, many of these things would have been taken care of, and it has not been, even within those societies. Even if I, think that Marx is probably going to help us understand the world we live in right now, it's not an answer to everything. The complexity challenges are real. Just retreating into vitalism, which is, I think, to mention Adam Curtis's answer to this. If we organize it a different way, things could be different. It would, as if that was just a choice, as if we chose to organize things this way. That's a vitalistic philosophy. Some of these were choices and some of these aren't. In regards to management elites, people hoarding power, some of this is actively misleading, opportunistic. I mean, when you saw Hillary Clinton, who in 2008 was running as like the working man's overall candidate. I know people forget this, but I'm old. I remember. And then in 2016 is picking up the language of the online left, and which is filtered through a very moral reaction. And yet a lot of those same people, Kirsten Sinema, um, wrote a thesis on Gambin, wrote recently about fighting the cops, and now as a senator voting down the minimum wage. How does this all really work? you can't pretend to have. I don't have a diagnosis for all the problems that we have. Yes, I could say capitalism, and I would even believe I'd be right, but that doesn't explain the particular instantiation of capitalism right now. I was talking to Doug Lane today, and he realized that trying to explain the Italian communist position in light of just ideological positions and not in the way that capitalism was developing unevenly in Italy and the way the different councils were and what the different sectors' interests were and how they were operating, and this, idea that it's about like ideological glosses, like, oh well, Bordiga wasn't Leninist enough and Gramsci was too Stalinist or whatever, misses that those ideological glosses were happening in a context on the ground in a specific country in a specific developmental period. We are also in a specific country in a specific developmental period in a specific time. We're in different regions of the country from different classes of the country. We have different interests. Our long-term interests have to be understood concretely. Our programmatic needs have to be figured out, and you have to build them up. And just base building is like the primitive accumulation of cadres. I'm not against base building. I'm not insulting people who do that, but to just do it is almost like a multi-level marketing scheme, but no one's even getting rich. It becomes an accumulation of social power. Well, if you're not going to use that social power for something, then what are you doing? If you're going to use it for something, then fine, but you need to figure out what that is and how you're going to do it, and you need to deal with these complexity realities, and more than just like, Lenin said it, I'm going to do it, or I have a moral position and vague moral sentiments and I'm going to act off of it. Think about all that.